keybomb.com.
All right, moving on. Below that, we have a filter envelope and an amp envelope. So what does an envelope do? Well, an envelope controls how the synth is going to behave or react over time. From when you first hit the note, to as you're holding the note, to when you release the note. The envelope has 4 parameters, A, D, S, R. That stands for attack, decay, sustain, and release. Every envelope is going to have those 4 parameters. They might have more parameters in addition to that, but those are always going to be there. Those are the basic 4, attack, decay, sustain, release. The filter envelope controls how the filter reacts over time. The amp envelope controls how the amp reacts over time. So just quick demonstration. With the attack on the amp set at 0, the instant you press the note down, you hear a sound. If I move the attack up, kind of fades in a little bit, and as I move it up more, it's a real slow fade. So you can really control how that behaves. I'm going to skip the decay and sustain for now and just jump right over to the release. With the release set to 0, the instant you let go of a note, it stops. If I move it up and let go, little fade out, move it more, longer fade outs, etc. Okay? The same is really true of how the filter works. It sets how the filter engages over time. So if I set the attack longer, you can hear that the filter opens up a little slower, and etc. Okay? Again, more on that in our later tutorials where we go more in depth. All right, moving on. I'm going to jump over to this section right here, which deals with 2 controls. One's portamento and one is polyphony. Now, polyphony refers to how many notes the synth can play at any one given time. Polyphonic means you can play more than 1 note at a time. The earliest synths were monophonic, meaning you can only play 1 note at a time. Now, you might ask yourself, well, why would I want to limit the polyphony? Well, it depends on the kind of sound you want to produce. For a pad, obviously, you want the polyphony set to a higher number so you can play multiple notes at one time. However, there are certain characteristics to the sound that can really only be achieved when it is set to monophonic. So in this case, to set it to monophonic, we set that to a polyphony of 1. Now, right now, if I hold down 1 note and then hit another, the next one cuts off the first note and immediately the pitch jumps. If I take the portamento and increase that a little bit and do the same thing, you have a little bit of a scooping pitch effect, kind of like a slide whistle or a trombone. If I set that even higher, the effect is more drastic. Classic example is the synth solo in Lucky Man by Emerson, Lake and Palmer. Or if you're a fan of Kill Bill, if I set this a little higher, you might recognize this from right before a fight scene. Okay. Or you might recognize this from Pac-Man. Alright, so I'm going to back that down to 0. And we're going to move on to our LFO section, which is right here. Now, LFO stands for low frequency oscillator. And I'll go more in depth to that later, but what the LFO basically is commonly used for is adding more characteristics to the sound in terms of how it behaves over time. Not in the same way an envelope does, but for instance, I'm actually going to dial in a little LFO here using the mod wheel. And there we have a little instant vibrato effect. Increase that a little bit. Okay. Change the speed of the vibrato. Okay. I can change the type of wave. Now let's make that faster. Okay. I can also use that and route it to, instead of the oscillator, which would change the pitch, I can route it to the filter. And now the filter is opening and closing at the rate we specify and at the wave shape that we specify. All right? Now, moving over here, I use the mod wheel to trigger that. Now, I don't necessarily have to use the mod wheel, but the reason I like using the mod wheel is because it's, it's basically a great performance controller. As I'm playing, I can use the mod wheel to dial in the specific kind of modulation. Now, depending on your synth, you might have some really advanced modulation routing. This one has pretty awesome modulation routing. I can set it to the filter frequency, the resonance, the LFO, set phase, inject some frequency modulation into that, which is, another thing we'll get into later. But anyway, again, it's a performance controller, and you can set it to control different things. And then finally, we have our trusty pitch bender, which bends the pitch up and down. So if I hold a note and I let go of the pitch bender, it snaps back to the center. I can go down, up, okay? And I can bend the pitch. So there's our brief overview. Once again, we have the oscillator, which generates the tone to begin with. We have the filter, which changes the color of the tone by filtering out certain frequencies. We have the amp, which controls the volume. We have the two envelopes here, the amp envelope and the filter envelope, which control how the filter and amp respectively behave over time. We have the LFO, which can be used to control in a different way how the sound reacts over time. We have our polyphony setting, which affects the number of notes that we can play at any given time. The portamento, which can scoop the pitch from one note to the other. The mod wheel, which is a performance controller that can control whatever we specify it to control. And the pitch bender, which bends the pitch up and down. Thanks for listening, and tune in for the next parts where we go more in depth on each of those modules.